chops. Preamble, summer is coming to a close, but as I always say out loud at least once around this time, the weather is still beautiful in September, yada yada, so it's still barbecue season over here because everything tastes better when it's cooked outside, and that is 100% true in this case because charcoal is a taste that can't be replaced. Anyway, today we're going to make a spicy Korean bulgogi marinade using a recipe by one of my favorite channels on YouTube, Future Neighbor. I've sort of turned it into my own thing over the course of the summer by increasing the marinating time, changing the cooking method, and adding in charcoal, which is an ingredient unto itself. We're getting started with gochujang, which is a spicy fermented paste from Korea. To a large bowl, to which you will add the pork later after mixing in the marinade, add 4 tablespoons of gochujang and 1 tablespoon of chili flakes, otherwise known as gochugaru. We're going to round things out with 2 tablespoons of honey, 1 tablespoon of soy sauce, a half tablespoon of sugar, and 1 tablespoon of mirin. Cooking wine or regular white wine also works. After that, I grate in some garlic on a microplane. This time of year, the garlic coming out of the farmers markets is enormous. Each clove is like the size of my entire thumb. So if you're doing this at home, approximate with 2 or even 3 cloves of regular grocery store garlic. Or you can totally leave it out if you're intolerant. It's not a cornerstone of this dish. After that, the recipe calls for adding salt and pepper to the marinade, but I am leaving out the salt because I heavily salted this piece of meat a day in advance, according to the super awesome and scientific book called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Samin Nosrat, which goes deep into the subject of how to season your meat and when. Combine everything into a smooth paste with a whisk, and then it's time to add some thinly sliced pork. Future Neighbor's recipe specifies 400 grams of pork for this recipe, but I confess I rarely pay attention to these things and I always eyeball it. I will tell you this marinade goes a long way and has never done me dirty, no matter how much or how little meat I add to it. It also works great with chicken, so you would have to eyeball that anyways. Okay, so you can use any cut you wish as long as it's got some fat along with it. I'm going with this piece of Ossabaw pork loin, which, long story short, came from an entire pig we purchased from a family farm 50 kilometers away in Duncan, BC. He was a super fatty boy, so I got to trim off this fat to a more saner ratio. I'm also going to pay attention to how I'm slicing this pork so things end up tender later on. So if you see how the grain in this piece runs across this way, I'm going to cut across the grain here so the pieces aren't stringy. So I'm going to slice this pork into thin slices about 1/4 inch thick with a decent meat to fat ratio if you can help it. And I like to do longer strips and fold them over the skewers in random ways to create more surface area for grilling later on. If any of the slices turn out too thick, you can use a meat tenderizer or any type of mallet to whack them a few times and thin things out a bit. So when you've got what looks to you like a good ratio of meat to marinade, get in there with your hands and mix and massage it all up really well, and then take a moment to contemplate your actions before washing your hands and covering the bowl. Lately, I'm trying to reduce the use of plastic in my kitchen, so I'm using this super sophisticated and scientific patented plate on bowl system. It's not as see-through as plastic, but it won't end up suffocating a baby whale somewhere, and so my conscience is clear. Sometime before you're ready to grill, you're going to need to load all these pieces onto some skewers for grilling. So here's my method. Holding 2 metal skewers, I use 2 to prevent the meat spinning around during grilling. Take each piece of pork and thread it onto both skewers, folding the meat if necessary when you've got longer strips. Thread the meat onto the skewers in a way that distributes the end pieces all around the skewers like spikes. So don't stack everything in one perfect lined up stack when you're skewering. You got to rotate the meat around the skewers in a janky way, even if you have to place meat on one of the 2 skewers as you're stacking. This is to make sure there are lots of random surface area bits to pick up char later during grilling. Okay, start your coals. Honestly, I don't have a special 3-zone method like other fancy videos. Depending on how much meat I'm grilling, I put some coals in. If I'm just grilling 1 or 2 skewers, I arrange the coals in a road-like pattern so as to not burn too much fuel for a small amount of meat. Then I take out my blowtorch and I just light the coals with it. Yeah, I light the coals with the blowtorch. This is sort of a hot and fast method. I put the meat on the grill and then let it heat up to start cooking for a few seconds, and just as the juices are dripping onto the coals and starting to send up flares, I put the lid on and close all the vents to let everything heat up and get smoky. After a few minutes, I take the lid off, I check the underside. If things are looking nicely charred in spots but not burnt all across the surface, I flip, I wait for a few seconds, I replace the lid. I repeat this process a few times every few minutes until I can see a few visual cues. First, the overall volume of the meat goes down as it cooks and the meat begins to look tighter on the skewers. Second, I'm moving things around based on which parts are cooking first to ensure the surface of the skewer is evenly distributed with bits of char all across the knobbly bits. So if things are going too fast on the surface, you can move the meat further away from the heat and replace the lid to let things catch up a bit on the inside. Charcoal grilling is kind of like riding a bicycle. You have to get a feel for it, and once you do, it'll feel natural and not as much of a pain in the ass as it might have seemed at first. Over the summer, this has gone from something we do as a special occasion on the weekend to something I totally bust out if I'm having a shitty Monday. It always puts me in a good mood. I highly suggest you try this. After the meat rests for a few minutes, or up to a few hours if you're a mom like me who sometimes eats after the kiddo goes to bed, serve it over rice. The little charred bits combined with the sauce on top of the warm, fluffy rice is like a winning combination. You can add any green veg that you like, and there you go.